Good day, everyone. My name is Sam Priestley. I am the Vice President of Communications for the United States Association for Energy Economics. We welcome you to today's webinar, the Renewable Fuel Standard, a guide to America's biofuel mandate. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A function in the chat. Today is our pleasure to introduce you to our speaker, Tyler Gray. He will discuss an evidence-based guide to the Renewable Fuel Standard, the federal biofuel mandate that uses tradable RIN credits to shape fuel markets. The webinar will unpack the EPA's 2026 to 2027 reset, including record volumes, small refinery exemption, reallocation, and the removal of eRINs, and examine what the evidence says about fuel prices, agriculture, emissions, and regional impacts. Tyler currently serves as Director of Energy Innovation at LSU's Energy Institute. Prior to this role, he served as Secretary of the State of Louisiana's Department of Energy and Natural Resources. Before that, he held positions as Director of Corporate and Government Affairs for Placid Refining Company, and he was President of the Louisiana Mid-Continent Oil and Gas Association. He also served as an attorney in the Department of Natural Resources, Office of Conservation, and for the City of New Orleans. He graduated with a Bachelor's of Art in Economics from James Madison University in Virginia. He received his JD from Loyola University in New Orleans and an MBA with a specialization in economics from Louisiana State University. Mr. Gray is licensed to practice law in Louisiana and currently serves on several public and private boards and commissions. We would like to thank USAEE sponsors for making this event possible. In particular, the Energy Institute at LSU, who provided the infrastructure for this event. Lastly, we would like to mention Energy Fundamentals 2026. It is a week-long course offering a comprehensive overview of the U.S. energy sector, covering the history, science, and economics of energy production and consumption. The first session is currently running this week, but registration is currently open for the second week-long session, which will happen next month from July 13th to the 17th. If you are interested in becoming a sponsor for USAEE, please contact us at usaee@usaee.org for more information. Our webinar is structured as follows. Tyler will give a 45-minute presentation, followed by 10 minutes of Q&A from our audience. Tyler, thank you for joining us.
Looking forward to today to talking about one of the most complicated things I've ever encountered, and that is the Renewable Fuel Standard, which is was created in 2000, the early 2000s under the Energy Security Act. Okay, hopefully everyone can see that now. Well, so good morning from the West Coast. Appreciate you guys again taking the time. I wanted to talk a little bit about the Renewable Fuel Standard and a guide to America's biofuel mandate, and just sort of try to give an overview of what I've experienced with it, and things I've learned through it, and a lot of what are the economics that have been the markets that have been created as part of sort of this artificial government mandate that's been created. And so the Renewable Fuel Standard was originally created in the early 2000s, like I said, where President Bush was looking for ways in order to increase the domestic fuel supply here in the United States. And they started leaning more towards what I like to call new plants compared to old plants. So if you have a lot of the fossil and traditional fossil fuels, that would be oil, things like that. The old plants, you're looking more towards some of the newer renewable fuels being the newer plants. Ethanol comes from corn, soybeans, things like that. And so the primary regulations that fall in this are in 40, Part 80, Subpart M, and then you have a huge section of that ends up being about 1,000 pages. I tried to quote as much of as I could through this document. And again, these will be available post presentation and working through it. And then, wait, what happened there? Most recently, there was some volume. And so the RFS goes through a process in which they track each barrel or volume, gallon, whatever. They have several different categories that they put the products into with what's called a renewable identification number. And typically that number or is the the common term that's used is RIN, RIN, RIN. And so those are what are actually tracked and submitted to the EPA at the end of each regulated period. And then that determines whether or not the regulated community is in compliance. And so the way that this regulation is set up is that it's actually the refineries. So it's the oil and gas refineries are the ones that have to report these volumes, and that the volumes would be what are sold at their racks or any other places to determine what volume of fuel there is at the end of that period. And that was one of the ways that really got into this, was working for sort of the petrochemical sector directly, was able to learn more about how this directly impacts business, how the market moves almost without connection to any other variable. It's just a very interesting, disconnected market, somewhat driven pricing for the RIN in terms of compliance for the refineries. There's a lot of what I would call peer review evidence that comes from the Congressional Research Service, and so that is the organization that researches for Congress, for the legislative branch, and the GAO, Government Accountability Office, that would be for the executive branch. So because of the complicated nature of it, you end up having only government organizations that have been able to draft and produce peer-reviewed products, which is something that can be difficult from multiple different stakeholders having positions on this particular regulation. And again, to try to set the stage a little bit for what you're dealing with, is that you have a large group of oil and gas refiners. They're one group. You also have a lot of the farming community, the producers of soybeans and corn, which ultimately ends up being ethanol. And then you have a lot of other little smaller groups, which include, you'll have some of the convenience stations, things like that, but then also biofuel creators. And you have these specific categories that they can get credit for it. And actually, in Louisiana, we do have some where they're actually extracting methane that is coming off of garbage dumps that is then converted into a renewable identification number, or a RIN, and it falls under a specific category. So you do see sort of a growing market in that respect. And again, it's important to just include that this is just sort of my own personal analysis. It's not legal or investment advice or the institution's position. So the 5 questions I'm trying to figure out, what I wanted to talk about today is sort of what exactly has this RFS, what was the intent of when it was created, who is it meant to regulate, and through what legal mechanisms is it regulating? Then the second part is you have a RIN economics, where you have a tradable compliance credit that has turned a quantity mandate into prices, which is one of the things that I find most interesting about this process. And most recently, the EPA did a finalization of the volumes at a record high. Now, I have my theories as to why this was done. But so every couple of years, the EPA is now able to set volumes of what will be required nationwide, and what would be submitted from each refiner or other regulated party, obligated party is what it's called in this program, would have to submit to be in compliance for that year. And so you do get some publicly available data. It can be challenging to find it, but what evidence we do have access to are fuel prices, sort of emissions that come from those facilities. You have the agriculture soybean product, what's exported, what's coming in and out of the ports, and then what the farming agriculture community is producing. And ultimately, having a handful of data points, but there are still some things that are hard to get a hold of. And then, what are some open questions that one person could answer? And unfortunately, a lot of this is driven by politics, which is one of the reasons why I think that you have a really high volume um, set record high this year. Okay, so the mandate machine, who has to comply and who has to turn in these volume obligations, and sort of what does that formula look like? Again, so 2005 Energy Policy Act creates the RFS, Renewable Fuel Standard. And so originally these were set by Congress or by the act itself, and you had certain volumes that had to be produced for the reason being that the United States would be able to sort of wean off of this foreign oil, not unlike the situation we're dealing with today. Luckily, between this period 2005 into over the next 10 years, the U.S. will have a huge amount of domestic production that'll sort of increases the need for this. Excuse me, let me say it a different way. With the domestic oil production, there's not the same level of foreign reliance, but at the same time, this program still exists. So this is where it sort of becomes this delicate balance in managing this. So in 2005, you have the first 4 billion gallons required to be used within the fuel supply. 2005 and 2007, they created these nested categories, RFS2, this is where you get into some of the more specifics on the different types of RINs that are being submitted, which includes ethanol, which is the basic D6 RIN. And then you have other categories, D3, D4, D5, and D7, which is sort of a newer, unique category. And in the Energy Policy Act, you also ended up also having a lot of sort of this runway given to the executive branch that would then be able to implement the rules going forward. And so you do have these sort of dates in which the EPA gets more control of implementing those rules with consultation by the Department of Energy. Just make sure that's known. Okay, and then most recently, including in the Trump administration, you have seen the set volumes. So the set era specifically refers to the statutory tables that were created in that act from 2005. They created the volumes that were required under Congress, and then at this point, the executive branch has full control to set those volumes. Which, from a regulated community standpoint, at the time there was concern that that it would be set with unrealistic volumes and that could never be complied with, or they had sort of a political motive behind them. Then I have my own personal theories as it relates to under the Biden administration about the way they were using the electronic RIN or the eRIN, and then most recently, sort of how they and why they've set these volumes so high. So this is the nested categories, and I did my best to try to present it in a way that hopefully makes sense. Unfortunately, a lot of the stuff with the RFS does not make sense. So the largest box here, the D6 renewable fuel, that's meant to encompass the entire set, right? So a regulated or an obligated party has to submit a certain number of D6 RINs. It's the largest number of RINs that they have to submit. And that is primarily when renewable fuel or ethanol is mixed with gasoline, it creates a D6 RIN. And, not having total familiarity with the audience, I just do want to say, so every time you go to fill up your car with gasoline, you'll see on the pump, it'll say a percentage of ethanol. And so that 10%, that is actually blended into gasoline, and that is part of the fuel supply. And so you have these other categories. These are some of the newer categories around advanced biofuels. And then they're also mixed with some type of traditional fuel. It was explained to me that it's almost like cooking when you're creating the fuels. You have to meet certain specs, you have to meet requirements, octane levels, but ultimately it's being created by ingredients. And so how do you work and have those ingredients mixed in determines which RIN you will get. And so as the years have gone by, there's a requirement to have a certain number of each RIN. So the renewable D6 RIN, which is ethanol again, You'll have to have a certain number of that. There has been increases on the D4, the D3, and D5. There have been years when you've not been able to get some of them, so they have to do waivers. And this last one is a D7 cellulosic, and that's intended. There's a process in which it becomes a designated what you're submitting piece, and each one of these have values depending on the market for some of the more challenging RINs to produce. So a biomass-based diesel is something that has to be created, and then that RIN, that D4 RIN, once the fuel is created, a RIN is assigned these categories: D4, D3, D5, and that compliance number can be traded. And ultimately, it's because when they first created the act, they needed to have a way for those that were closer to the Midwest to, well, the obligated parties that were closer to the agriculture or whatever communities that they were able to get the ethanol, needed to be able to move that value that were close to ethanol or the availability to produce that fuel to areas that were not. So I commonly use the Gulf Coast and the Midwest. And the way that they have done that through execution is they have a value that's assigned or can be traded, but each one sort of has a different process in which can be traded. And this is, again, where it gets complicated. A D6 RIN is created when the fuel or gasoline is blended with the ethanol. So that's who gets that credit. That credit can then be sold to an obligated party, say a refinery, that then turns it back into the EPA. The other categories, when the fuel is created, the RIN is created. So a D5, D4, D3, they could be created on site at an oil refinery. A renewable fuel, or D6, typically can be created on site as well, but also by non-obligated parties, gasoline stations, convenience stores. Some of the larger ones actually have operations because it's an additional value that's created through this process. And then the credit, because they're not obligated, can then be sold back. And that market moves based on the availability of the number of RINs that are out there. So not only is there a market for the feedstocks, the oil, natural gas, things like that, and the other inputs, but you're also looking at this market for a compliance credit, depending on where the fuel is blended and created. And those are actually moved and traded within the organizations that are using them. And so that's a whole nother market to track when it comes to an operational side for any large company, especially oil and gas, because they have to buy they have to buy credits in which they don't have compliance to create, or they don't have the power to create for compliance. So end of the year, you see if there's a smaller volume of these credits, obviously the prices will go up. If there's a large volume of those credits, the prices will go down. And it's very important what those look like from a business model standpoint, because they do, again, have value, can be sold, create revenue, things like that. But these are sort of the main drivers for this value transfer that comes within the fuel markets, or this subset of the fuel market, which is a traded RIN credit, depending on one of these compliance requirements, that then moves primarily through a 16-digit number. It makes me think of blockchain, honestly, the original blockchain, that can then be transferred to another obligated party and then sold back, or then returned to the EPA as part of our compliance requirements. And I'm sure that didn't make any sense. It feels like it didn't even make sense to talk about it. So I'm going to try to continue to move on, but just know that that's sort of the basic framework for any of these things that we'll start to talk about. And again, so who owes what? The renewable volume obligation, commonly called the RVO, is a formula that's in the Code of Federal Regulations. It's cited here. So refiners and importers of gasoline and diesel, they actually have a specific citation. Blenders below 250,000 gallons a year, and certain others are carved out. So there are exceptions, but the contested point of obligation choice is constantly in a conversation for a long time. That's not really any more of a conversation. Um, and so the point of obligation means, is the obligated party the refinery? Is it at what point along the value chain is that obligation created? And so that for a long time was contested. Now really looking at the truck rack or, when these different RINs are created. So the EPA will set a national percentage standard, and this is new each year. And then so each firm multiplies them by its own fossil fuel, fossil gasoline plus diesel volume, mandates scale with market share automatically. And a lot of this stuff is done internally, but ultimately ends up on the Energy Information Administration website, or EIA. And so what's excluded is the renewable fuel itself. Exports, you have an exemption for small refineries, so that's why it says this fuel from exempt small refineries. Um, and then there are some states that are exempt unless they opt in, because the market would be impossible. Now, the exemption for small refineries is another highly contested issue that's gone through some iterations of how it would be implemented. And then the deficit carryover, there are terms or times in which a firm that is not in compliance, you can move that obligation forward. And so this is just some of the details on how the RIN is created. I think that's something that can infer from just sort of reading through it. But all of these numbers and whatnot have a meaning to it. And so this is the sort of the part that becomes relevant to this group, which is sort of what is when a mandate is created by the government, it creates a price essentially. And so you have these different events that the price changed, or they had these significant events that really impacted those markets. And so when you think through, is it a tax? Is it a subsidy? And this is sort of some of that piece, but it does think through or flush out, how are these numbers being set, right? So and they're usually between, a RIN could be 1 cent. It's gotten, into the $2 to $3 per RIN. And so how is that also transferred down to the consumer purchasing the fuel at the pump is another category of value transfer that's hard to signal where those particular costs are being embedded into the value chain. And so the part that really drives some of the pricing originally is when they set the RVO. So annually or a certain period of time, EPA will set the renewable volume obligation, which essentially creates the market of what will be required to be submitted. And then from that, the individual firms start to carve out their market share into what their obligation would be based on what has been produced. And so that's how they start to be able to tell where, what, and how those RINs will be valued and what types of RINs will be required. And theoretically, that starts to set the market for those values. Traditionally, and I say that because you would think from a free market standpoint that they would move in a traditional way, but sometimes they don't necessarily move the way you expect. There are certain events that are related to government disclosure or announcements that result in significant price jumps or spikes. Okay. Right. I'm sorry, I just saw the question here. I'm going to skip back to the exchange rates, renewable diesel and biodiesel. Okay. So let me just sit back here. Oh, okay. So RINs are denominated in ethanol equivalent of volumes. So 1 physical gallon of renewable diesel creates 1.7 RINs. And how that mandates to gallons are really mandated energy, and the equivalent volume of fuels sort of stretch further against the obligation. And so this is where they get into sort of what is the percentage of biofuel or renewable share that's being input to a single gallon. What is the energy content? Traditionally, I would call this octane. And so that's what a vehicle or any sort of combustion engine would require in order to operate. And then they use ethanol is the foundation or the baseline for that as the general, what the BTUs per gallon would be created. And so they create those RINs that exchange based on that ethanol or octane energy content in I want to say 1 physical gallon. Sometimes it feels like it changes a little bit, but within that gallon, how much energy is created. And then that is what's transferred into these exchange rates for higher values of RINs. And so if I'm creating now there's differences between renewable diesel and biodiesel that comes from feedstocks and what is actually put into it. So you'll have animal fats that will be processed into a biodiesel type product when it's blended with a traditional diesel. And so that gallon provides 1.5 RINs based on the energy content and the renewable share of that content or a gallon itself. And so it becomes something that if I have a single gallon and I'm using more renewable content compared to the traditional fossil diesel with that to create a certain amount of energy in 1 gallon, that's what determines your RIN value. But it's all used as a baseline against a traditional gasoline or diesel volume with a certain percentage of ethanol. And so that is sort of the foundation of way that this stuff was created. But again, balancing how much renewable volume is in the gallon itself, how much energy does it produce, and then therefore transfers to the sort of what that RIN is accounted for or equivalence value within the framework. Okay. So another component, and I mentioned this a couple seconds ago about where these RIN prices moving through this process, and that is a lot where in the EPA documents that have been there's this concept of the pass through of the RIN price to retail, and there's been disagreement with some obligated parties as to exactly where that cost is, and then how is it passed through down the chain. And you have every time you transport a volume and it moves into the hands of a different carrier, there is a cost that is added to that. So when a feedstock is transferred to a refiner, which is then processed into and sold at a rack, or it could be transported by pipe, sold at a truck rack, and then transported to the convenience store. All of those have an increasing cost. The challenge has become the obligated party is trying to bring value back into their firm with a product that the consumer, being the truck or the transporter, knows is required by law. And so there's created this leverage of negotiating power for the transporter from the truck, rack, or the refiner to the consumer, ultimately being individuals like you and I. Because it's required by law, it's created some leverage at that point in terms of increasing the costs. And so the pass through, where is that? Who is eating that cost has been a contentious discussion, I would say, over the last 10 years. consumer-facing discount on high ethanol E85. And so that is a higher percentage content of ethanol in the fuel itself, 15%. And recently, there has been more, they've started to relax the requirements. Traditional vehicles prior to, I'd say, 1993 had trouble with the E85 or the higher content of ethanol, and their engines would lock up. But now we're seeing more of the newer vehicles on the market. Therefore, you're seeing less of these challenges with the higher content of ethanol. And so where is that subsidy? Where is that? Because ethanol is cheaper theoretically than fossil fuels sometimes, depending on the market. And then so how does that balance and pass through at the pump? So just checking with the time, I see that probably wanted to spend another 10 to 12 minutes talking through some of these slides, and then wanted to be able to at least answer some questions. And so trying to, walk, again, just looking at how things have changed, these big events, and presenting it from sort of the different perspectives that I've been able to see it from, depending on the position. And so when this program originally started, a single D6 RIN was valued between 1 to 5 cents, and it really had very little impact on obligated parties, the firms that were actually, bearing that cost. Now, that was also when Congress had mandated the volumes. It was very clear what it would look like. And it's actually at a time when obligated parties learned that ethanol actually increased the octane of a gallon. And so it became sort of ultimately what ended up being a great sort of start. And at that point, this obligated cost, 1 to 5 cents. And so then you started to get to this point in which the market was so saturated with E10 that there started to be a limitation on how, the number of RINs that could be sold. And so at that point, when you start to have fewer RINs, right, that could be purchased for compliance, the prices jumped up to it could have been more than $1.40 per RIN. And so that's per gallon that these RINs are created, one RIN. So you're looking at this additional $1.40 per gallon that could be placed on. And if gas right now is $6 a gallon, then you're looking at $7.50 a gallon, right? Is sort of that, and that's what that blend wall is where the market becomes so saturated with this particular product. There's no way to sell more of it. You can't blend it, you can't create it. Therefore, there's a limitation on that supply. Prices jump up. However, the government was able to react to that over the next 5 months, and so they dropped back down to 20 cents. But just thinking about a traditional market, say Wall Street or the stock market over the years, a shift from $1.40, if I'm buying and selling that for that amount at that time, that if I buy that RIN for $1.40 and then sell it for 20 cents, there's a significant loss there. And so there just becomes this highly scrutinized, focused approach to these things, is because of the value shifts as such, based on government announcements or government mandates, that the swings were pretty significant and typically all relate around elections and things like that. And it is also interesting just to keep in mind is most presidential candidates at this point have to be prepared to speak about this during their initial runs because of the starts in Iowa, which is a very and key component state to this process. So the other thing about this spike in 2013, there were a couple of relief valves, and this is where the small refinery exemption boom and the point of obligation fight all trace to it. And so these events are what created this volume relief. But the small refinery exemption in law, the tax code, and then also under the Clean Air Act, there is a section that allows for a small refinery that produces less than 75,000 barrels in a calendar year on average per day, that they qualify as a small refinery. However, there are other component parts to that that have been applied and used as part of this analysis. And therefore, you've had situations where the administrations come in, they grant a lot of the exemptions, which then creates the obligation, and what that volume would look like is what really impacts these prices, because as the obligated party changes and the number of obligated parties change, then you have this, whether it could be a surplus of RINs or a higher volume of RINs, and that'll play out with this reallocation issue that comes in later years. And so, again, coming back to this sort of nested process, and all of these different things affect these prices. And each category of RIN, D4, 5, 3, or 6, they all have a value associated with them, and each announcement creates different impacts on those respective prices. And as part of that, the nesting does help with some of the more challenging RINs to be able to get. So a D3 RIN could count in the D6 bucket. So you do have sort of a little bit of flexibility that comes into this, but very limited. Because normally biomass-based diesel, a D4 RIN, trades at a premium to the D6. So even though you get a little bit more of the value, or the 1.7 from a biodiesel or renewable, it still creates a higher cost of compliance, and how that relates to D6, whether there's nesting or not. And it becomes sort of this interaction between how do the inner mandates, or these inside, these nesting D4, D3, and how do they relate to those D6? And how does that interact with them, plus the RVO and what those are all set at? You're creating multiple different pricing impacts for this individual compliance cost. So these are some of the escape valves that have been used. If there are not cellulosic RINs really available, the EPA can sell those credits when they fall short, making them available. But they have to be associated with a RIN itself. It's one of those things where they can't just grant relief. You have to have the RIN in hand, and then they can enhance it, have it considered cellulosic for another type for compliance. You do have, under the Clean Air Act, the EPA has reduced volumes if there's inadequate supply, severe harm. I mean, I almost look at that as acts of God and legal contracts. And then there are opportunities if there's a deficit for the obligation, that it can be carried over into the future. But again, you have a market of obligation that is then isolated with individual firms, that then their market extends across multiple regulated periods. It's just a very complicated value as to what is used and needed. Okay, let's go on to the next one, 16 and then 17. And so here are the finalized numbers straight from the EPA's table. They're all in billion RINs. Remembering that a RIN is an ethanol equivalent gallon. The total for renewable obligation for 2026 is 25.82 billion. After the exemption reallocation, which we'll talk about a little later, a total applicable volume is slightly lower, and then gets to 2702 in 2027. And then within that, advanced at the, you see sort of these different numbers that are for the biomass-based diesel, and that's all, again, directly from the EPA tables. We can go to the next one, I think. Okay, and so this was sort of the bigger aspects of this, is that beyond the volumes, the rule that they announced make four structural moves. First, the most consequential for the market balance is a 70% reallocation of small refinery exempted volumes. And so if you're looking at an obligation from a refinery that makes less than 75,000 barrels per year on a calendar day, their volumes are then reallocated onto other producers. And so that can be contested because you end up having, again, it's all about trying to balance the market share. But if you have these certain numbers that could potentially end up being obligated for more fuel than the market demands, again, fuel production is based on market demand. And so if you have a higher volume and you can't meet that obligation because there's no market for it, then you sort of had this issue that pops up between the two. But again, reallocating from one firm to another that not necessarily are connected at all. And the exemptions stop being demand destruction and become demand redistribution. That's what they want to be able to do. Second, the eRINs are gone. This was electronic RIN was created under the Biden administration that would have been attributed to the car manufacturers in the creation of electric vehicles. And that was there's some rumors about what that was intended to do, but would sort of transfer value from the obligated party of the fuel producers and putting that into the hands of the car manufacturers. Renewable electricity is removed as a qualifying fuel. And so then you had this anticipated credit market on the EV charging powered by biogas before it ever got going. The import haircut, EPA has proposed generating fewer RINs from imported renewable fuel and foreign feedstocks. That was the half RIN proposal. And again, sort of that takes away from the original intent of the act, which was to rely on domestic production. And the 2025 cellulosic waiver mentioned. So all four moves managed to capture the program's rents, exempt versus non-exempt refiners, domestic versus foreign producers, electricity versus liquid fuels. And the set era has made the RFS an annual distributional bargaining table. And the rule is the clearest evidence yet. So it becomes this sort of negotiating point for all the different fuel vehicles into one announcement for the government. And that will set values for the whole year. Next slide. And so here are some of the exemptions in practice. These are some of the numbers that have been granted on the small refinery piece. And so this impacts that demand. We can go to the next one. And so this is trying to capture what's going on with these exemptions in one picture and how that impacts the market. If you have no exemption, they just buy and retire RINs based on the production. If you could be exempt, then they win this hardship as it's determined. The volume drops out of the obligation base. And then so that's the demand destruction, the RIN demand falls. And so this reallocate rule, which is more recent, they're trying to keep the demand at the level for renewable fuels like ethanol, but the obligation shifts to non-exempt refiners. And so how does that relationship play out? Next slide. And so this is from a pricing standpoint, does this pass through all the way to the consumer? So, there's been a lot of different conversations about this where the SREs have been granted small refinery exemption, the demand falls, the rent price falls, and then the compliance cost falls per fossil gallon. So does the pump price fall? We haven't necessarily seen that, and it's hard to prove that that would happen because there's so many different parties that are involved in this. And so you have this pass-through discussion about where those costs are coming in. And this is just talking about sort of what's happened with that over the years. And next slide. So what fixing the RFS since 2019, here are just several different things that have happened in the last 6 years, 7 years, where they've tried to sort of fix what's going on. And again, as this has evolved, becoming this negotiating table of for the whole fuel market, and then also this electric fuel for EVs being discussed and how that would be valued. You have the 10th Circuit of Court of Appeals has had decisions that weigh in. You had the Fifth Circuit and the Gulf Coast have a decision that weighed in. It's just been a very complicated process to date, and each one of these announcements can shift the cost and price of the RINs. It's just a very complicated issue to deal with. And here are some of the case. Next slide. So here's some of the bigger cases and that have had a significant impact on these markets. And so tracking these, understanding what they've actually done and how they've impacted the market is a definitely challenging process. But again, trying to identify what triggers are creating market changes. That is actually one of the more complicated aspects of the pricing for these compliance credits. Brian, if we could skip down to 26, because and this is something I'll probably just try to wrap up on to at least take questions if we've got them. So this is the mandate and then the pads. So this is pads are this is how they track a lot of the things through EIA, which I'm sure most of you know. But each one has a different geographic or regional area that it covers. And so this is to show where this mandate is hitting each pad differently. So as you can see, the largest share is hitting the Gulf Coast, second Midwest. And so that's why this dynamic between pad 2 and 3 of the volume credit transfer plays out so significantly, because you're looking at almost 80% of the whole market takes place between 8 to 10 states. And if you could just Brian, if you could skip down to so the last and remaining slides really look into the different price shifts and what that looks like. And, going through the Midwest, the renewable diesel, you do have a discussion around greenhouse gas emissions depending on who's in power at the time. And then we get more into the research aspects of it. And I don't know, Brian, if you could just skip down to 37. So in closing, the RFS is a quantity mandate. It's created a market. You have nested standards, tradable compliance credits, exchange rates, runs the largest self-financing transfer in U.S. energy policy, all transferred domestically. It could be considered an implicit tax or a subsidy on the renewable gallons. And so that tax on fossil, subsidy for renewable, how does that play out, those price changes? This 2627 rule is actually what I would consider a reaction in the most sophisticated manner we've ever seen, because of an understanding of it and the potential that these record volumes are being prepared to be exempted out through SREs being granted, which is thoughtful and forward-looking, but again, it's still to be seen. And it really is a truly regional battle or markets that are trading value back and forth. Midwest, Gulf Coast are probably the largest areas in which that's happening. And again, I hope this was helpful in some respect. It's hard to cover the RFS and RINs even in an hour, just because it's so complicated and can get into such specifics, but try to use some of the graphs or diagrams to be able to communicate some of the basics. And hopefully this will be helpful for anyone else that's interested in this to be used in the future. It's been one of my research interests. I've been able to work through it to better understand how to create public documents that can be scrutinized and reviewed. So if you do have comments, and Brian, if you don't mind going to the last one, or 38. This is my contact information. Always happy to answer questions or discuss it. I have whiteboards, love to get into it. So happy to answer any questions if anyone has them.
Hey, Tyler, I actually have a question for you. who, there's a cost associated with the RINs, correct?
Yes.
So who does that cost ultimately get passed down to? Like, does it hit the consumer at the pump, or where does it go exactly?
So it depends on which party you talk to, is where you can find out where that cost is going. Um, each industry is complicated enough that it's almost where it goes into a black box, and the costs now, it's unclear exactly where it comes and who pays that cost directly. It's one of the, I mean, I do think one of the reasons is because there's so many moving parts. Because more recently, in the discussion of high gas prices, I have been able and had the opportunity to talk about, if I if the government did this, would this reduce the price at the pump? And there is evidence that this is added to the cost of fuel, but it's hard to tell exactly where that cost is moving. And to the point where I would almost say that more likely than not, a portion is being attributed at each point in the process. I don't think there's one payer. I think that the refiner bears some of the cost. I think the transporter ends up probably coming out a little bit on the positive as they develop more negotiation and leverage and negotiating prices and sales. But ultimately, I do think the consumers pay a portion in it as well. But it's not totally clear where that's going through. It's that pass through conversation, and who is paying that is really what it's not a clear cut answer. It's in there. There's a cost associated with it. There's value being transferred. It's just not exactly what point in the chain. I don't think any one party is bearing the full cost. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, that does. And I take it there hasn't been, you are not aware of any research that has been done into this to kind of decompose the cost. Would that be useful research?
I think it would. Um, there are aspects of that data set that are challenging because you'd almost have to put it, you'd have to identify that cost for each fuel type, and the RENs are created different ways.
Hmm.
And because I have tried to diagram this before, and so one of the challenging parts is so if I create a biodiesel or a renewable diesel and get a D3 or D4 REN, when that is created, the REN can be disconnected from the fuel. But for renew or like ethanol based RENs or D6 that we buy at the pump, those cannot be disconnected. They're always until that fuel is actually created, but it can never be removed from the barrel itself or the gallon. And that becomes part of the challenge, is you have different value chains that are created within one fuel market that can come from the same feedstocks essentially.
Gotcha. Well, does anyone else have any questions? There's
Sam, I did
hopefully
see
some. Oh,
Sam, I did see
they were asking if your slides would be available. The answer to that is webinar slides and the webinar recording will be made available on the USAEE website. All right. Well, Tyler, thank you so much for an outstanding webinar. This is really good to learn more about this market. We'd like to thank everybody else for attending, and I officially close this webinar.